We're in chapter 6, and we're going to be talking about the 7 seals. If we're tracking along, and as Tom started the last session out, this movie, and kind of tracking where this movie is going, we've done a lot of setup. We've done a lot of getting ready for the war. And chapter 6 is kind of like it's happening. It's our first look at some real things in terms of the tribulation, in terms of this war that's coming. Stuff is starting to happen in chapter 6. And so we're still looking from the perspective of, we have the 4 creatures in the throne room. We have, the seal, and the Lamb has taken this seal in his hand. And, as we summarized last time from chapter 5, there's just the one Lamb who is worthy to open this seal. And as we'll see in chapter 6, the seals begin to open, and we begin to see some things happening. So, Revelation chapter 6, verse 1. Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a loud voice like thunder, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Does anybody know who, a little bit later in Revelation, comes out on a white horse? Jesus. Jesus comes out on a white horse. If you're following on your notes, I told you to be looking at this first thing. There's a subject line in the middle, and it kind of gives you a summary and a connection between the 7 seals and the Gospels. When the Gospels tell us about the tribulation, this first seal, we believe, is a reference to the Antichrist. This is one of the first things that you see in the Gospels when they say what the tribulation is going to be like, is that there will be this Antichrist. And so the Antichrist comes out looking like, as best as he can do, Christ. He's trying to be Christ. He's trying to be recognized as the Savior, the Messiah, the hero. This is who this guy is. This is the beginning of the tribulation. That when this guy comes out, and he comes out conquering and to conquer, and he has a bow, and he has a crown, he has authority. This is the opening. This is when we should start. This is when we should look and say the beginning of the tribulation starts with this false Christ. And so he comes out conquering and to conquer, and that is our first of the 7 seals. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come and see." Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. So we now have the Antichrist. And I look at this as a progression. First comes the Antichrist. What's the next step in this progression? As the Antichrist comes, and he is this conqueror, this king, this supposedly great leader, what happens is war. And I believe as we talk about the effect of the Antichrist, and we talk about the end times, I think we're going to see war like we've never seen before. We've seen some pretty big wars. When World War I happened, that was stepped up beyond anything the world had ever seen. It was a whole new thing. When World War II happened, we took it way beyond that. Now imagine today what war would look like if all the countries, with all the advanced weaponry that we have today, if the restraining stopped. Because you realize that we're restrained right now. We have, our country alone, enough weapons to annihilate the entire human population. And we're not the only country that has that much weaponry. And so if you imagine just the fact, why don't we have these kinds of wars? Because we are restrained. Right? Whatever you want to look into, there's actually in 2 Thessalonians it talks about a restrainer. But even just thinking about logic. What's going on in the world? Pay attention to politics. Why don't we have these crazy huge wars? Because we restrain ourselves. Every nation that has nuclear weapons exercises restraint, and so we don't annihilate the entire population of the earth. What I think we're looking at with this second seal is that restraining is going to end. And we're going to see war beyond anything that anybody has ever seen. And so that's the second seal. In verse 5, it says, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." That denarius is a term for a day's wage, like a basic worker's daily living wage. And so when we're talking about a quart of wheat for a denarius, that's expensive. That's working all day long for, a small amount of food. And what we're talking about here is a famine. A time across the earth where food is hard to come by. And again, I think we can trace this as kind of a progression. What's going to happen if there's nuclear war all over the world? Crops are going to die.
Even if there's normal wars, I mean, you talk about all the distribution lines getting completely messed up. How do you get them?
Right. The interesting thing, if you study the history of wars, very, very often the actual bullets and bombs don't kill the most people. Most of the time it's diseases, it's famines, it's, different people not having access to clean water, and those are the things that really kill people. And that's what we're looking at here, is we have these crazy wars, and lots of people die in these wars, but then what's left? It's the victims of what's left behind after these wars happen. There's no food. There's no supplies. The structures that exist right now are torn down in these wars. And so we're seeing the Antichrist, who then brings war and famine. And when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. And so now we have the sort of final progression. I think we're going to see some death in the wars, and we're going to see some death in the famine. But at this point, in this fourth seal, what we're saying is you're going to see death on a new scale that we've never seen before. World War II, I think we saw something like 12 million deaths in that war. And then I believe it's about another 12 million that were murdered in Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union during that time, that were people murdering their own citizens because of all the various reasons they did that. But even that, 24 million people died during that war. That's nowhere near a fourth of the population. A fourth of the population today is like 1.5 billion people. Try to wrap your brain around those numbers. Think about how tragic it was when the Vegas shootings happened and something like 50 people died. Think about how tragic it was when 9/11 happened and 3,000 people died. Think about how tragic the wars that we have lived through, where we've seen tens of thousands die. And think about what would that be if 1.5 billion people died within a short space of time. It's unimaginable. It's mind-blowing to think about something that crazy. This is going to be an event or a series of events of epic proportions. When we're told this story, we're given this, and I kind of think about the format of the information that's coming here. The four creatures announcing this sort of fourfold judgment that's coming down, and the way that it's presented. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Is the church already gone at this time?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Please tell me it is.
I know a lot of people want to think that it is.
But if you believe on the post-tribulation, the church is still here?
If you believe in post-tribulation, you believe the church is still here when all of this stuff is happening. Pre-tribulationists would say that the church is gone when this is happening. And so, yeah, this is crazy. Whatever this is, it's crazy. It's unheard of in all of the history of the earth before this time. And so those first four, they kind of go together. And then we're going to look at the other seals are a little bit kind of belong to, I guess, a different category. But those first four are four judgments that come down and that characterize, I believe, the period of the tribulation. These are general characteristics of what the period of the tribulation is going to be like, where all of these crazy things are happening. And then we look at the fifth seal. And so the fifth seal, when he opened the fifth seal, this is verse 9, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then a white robe was given to each of them. And it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren, who would be killed as they were, was completed. And so we have a multitude here before the throne. We've kind of shifted our attention. We've been looking at judgments that are happening on the earth in the first four seals. And now we're seeing a multitude of people in heaven at this altar. And these are people. These are souls who have been slain for the word of God and the testimony which they held. So these are not angels. This is something different. These are human beings who have died apparently during all of these judgments that have been happening. And now they stand before heaven and they're eager for this thing to end. They're in heaven and saying, God, there's so much suffering on the earth right now. When is this going to end? Why are you doing this? Why is there so much? How long? How long is this going to happen? How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And so they're appealing to God for an end. Can we finish this up? Is it time? Is it time to come back down to the earth? Is it time to judge? Is it time to establish your kingdom?
I got a question on that. So, I'm looking at it, I'm reading that, reading the subnotes, and I'm thinking, okay, so during all this tribulation, there's going to be a mass amount of Christian persecution going on. That's what it's saying here. There's going to be, and then people are crying out to God that, they're saying, please take us away. God, come and fulfill your promise to us. And it's still, and he's basically saying, be patient, be patient, be patient. And meanwhile, we're being slaughtered and slaughtered. Who are those people that he's referring to? Is that people that are coming to Christ through the tribulation? Or through this part?
I believe, again, depending on the two different views, if you're a post-tribulationist like myself, then I would say that these are Christians who are still on the earth because the rapture hasn't happened and they've died in the various judgments that have happened, and now they're in heaven and waiting for God's judgment to be revealed. If you're a pre-tribulationist, then I believe, pre-tribulationists also believe the gospel is preached and Christians are getting saved during the tribulation.
I think it's pretty clear here too, that
right.
people are being saved.
Right, so these are believers who have died in the tribulation. The pre-tribulationists would say that, you know, when the rapture happens, and you have Jewish people, they usually say that Jewish people who've been left are going to figure out some, you know, oh, this story about Jesus was right, and Jesus really was the Messiah, and you know we better trust in God and accept the gospel, and those people will then become believers who are then suffering in the tribulation, and then they will be persecuted, they will die, and they would make up this body of people who ends up in heaven and asking God for relief from the judgment and the persecution that's happening.
So we're going to be conscious of, let's say, our family that is not Christian and reject Christ. So we're going to be conscious of what they are doing. Let's say we're one of those in heaven. We're able to see what's happening here.
Yeah, I believe that's what we're saying in this passage.
So the tears are still not wiped away.
Well, I think maybe not. And this is, you know, we can kind of go back and forth on this a little bit. I think that in this passage it seems clear that the people in heaven do know about the suffering on the earth, and they want the suffering to end. I think that we are still watching what's going on the earth. Now, as to the presence of tears, or whether there is any sadness, I really believe that the passage that promises no more tears comes later in Revelation, and I think that's where we're headed to. That there will come a day when all of the tribulation as well is over, that from then on no more tears.
That's when his kingdom's set up, right? That's when,
right.
That's when, yeah, okay.
So when there will come a time that there is no more tears at all because there's no more suffering at all. But I think at this point we can still be aware of what's happening on the earth, and we can still be emotionally connected to it. I do think it'll be a little bit different because we'll see from a different perspective. We'll see from God's perspective and hopefully have an appreciation for what's happening and the purpose behind it that maybe we don't see from our side of it now. But I think definitely that they're aware of what's happening, and I think you can tell from the passage that they don't like it. They don't want there to be all this suffering on the earth. Did you want to say something, Terry?
No, I just wanted you to explain why the raft is being poured out. Who's it for, and why is it happening?
Why is the wrath happening? I think it's the final outpouring of God's judgment on those who have rejected Him. So you have the whole human race. We've rejected God as a people, and I think we're being dealt with in that way.
This is the first half of the trib?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So this would be the first half of the tribulation, and we'll see that as we move on a little bit in the seals, and we move towards the next couple of things, and we get to the trumpets and all that. But yes, this is the first half of the tribulation. In fact, as we get to the second half of the tribulation, we get new numbers of percentages of death, and it gets even crazier. But yes, this is in the first half of the tribulation. So yeah, things are really, really bad, and they're not quite as bad as they're going to get just yet. But they get, yeah, exactly. And so a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them, this is the multitude who are in heaven who are saying, how long until you judge the earth? A white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as a sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. The kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. This is the final seal in this chapter. We're going to have a bit of a parenthesis between the 6th seal and the 7th seal. But this 6th seal cranks it up a notch. We've seen terrible wars and death and famine. At this point, what we're looking at is wholesale destruction. We're seeing John describing things that he's not sure how he can even describe. What does it mean for the sky to be rolled up like a scroll? What does it mean for the moon to turn to blood? I mean, I've seen a reddish looking moon. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that John is seeing that we haven't seen before. We're talking about destruction that he doesn't have words to describe. And so he's putting it in whatever words he can. To me, the most interesting part of that is this part at the end where it says, the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men. We've painted this picture of all the most powerful men on the earth. But then he also adds in there, and every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks and the mountains, and called, and the rocks fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. We talked about kind of in the beginning of Revelation and in chapter 1 when it talked about Jesus and the picture of Jesus there, the fearful picture of a conqueror and somebody who comes as a judge. We talked about that side of God that instills fear in us. That side of God comes out real strong here. And all these things that happen, we reach a point where there is no denying Jesus. Up until now, people denied Jesus through everything. Through his miracles, through his rising from the dead, through his bringing Lazarus back from the dead. Now, John's the one that told us how Lazarus raised from the dead, and the authorities said, we got to get rid of this guy. He's bringing people back from the dead. What are we going to do? We got to kill the guy he brought back from the dead so he stops witnessing. People will come up with any excuse to not believe Jesus. But Revelation tells about a time when there will be no more excuses, where those that have rejected Jesus will have nothing but fear, where they'll say to the rocks, fall on us and hide us, because we are terrified of the Lamb, which is an interesting picture, to be terrified of a lamb. It's interesting that they use there lamb instead of lion. If he'd said, I'm terrified of the lion, we could understand that. That would make good sense to us. But here, these people are calling on rocks to fall on them and kill them because they're terrified of the Lamb. And it just kind of boggles my mind to think, what if they realized that their fear of the Lamb could be, they could just choose the Lamb instead of being afraid? That they could place their faith in Jesus, they could be forgiven. There could be hope.
That's what makes it so hard to understand, that even to the very end, when you're even seeing these things, they're still going to reject him. And that's hard to believe that.
People do it all the time now.
Yeah.
In spite of all the evidence.
But they haven't seen what they're going to do.
Right.
Well, you're right, but you know,
Yeah.
Jesus told the Lazarus, then in the Luke story about Lazarus, he said, you know, you can go. Then the rich man was in Hades, and he said, let me go back and tell my brothers. And Jesus said, they have the Bible. And he said, oh, but if somebody came back from the dead and told them, they'd believe me. And Jesus said, if they won't believe the Bible, they won't believe you, even if you come back from the dead. I think we could say, if somebody won't listen to the Bible, they won't listen to rocks falling from the sky and the moon turn to blood. Some people will, but there will be people who will ignore everything and who will find a way to refuse to believe whatever it is, whatever signs God does. Because it's not true that God hasn't given us signs. He's given all kinds of signs in all kinds of different ways, in all kinds of different cultures and time periods and everything. There is ample evidence for anybody that wants to believe in Jesus. But everybody that doesn't want to finds a way not to. And so I'll just kind of also summarize based on your notes we've been looking at. The fifth seal there goes with martyrdom, which is also talked about in the three synoptic gospels as a part of the tribulation, that people will be martyred. And then we have these earthly and heavenly phenomena that are mentioned in Luke. But these things go along with the sixth seal, and I think Tom wants to share some more about the seals and the bowls and the trumpets.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you believe, or do you guys believe that the beginning of sorrows that Jesus talks about in Matthew has already began?
No, I think that's really what he's talking about here. If you look through the Matthew passage, what you see is it lines up perfectly with Revelation 6. So we talk about that. We talk about the birth pangs thing, and we look around our world and we go, yeah, that's kind of like that. But it isn't like that. It isn't like what you just shared.
Taking mountains off the planet.
Right, and massive death and massive famine, and you don't have to go very far. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but let me just say couple of quick things. Just kind of move forward some of what I heard from James. If you think about it, go back 20 or 30 years. Can you imagine people talking about doomsday preppers? Or how about another phrase, zombie apocalypse? When would you have ever heard like that? And yet that's common vocabulary now, isn't it? I don't know about you guys, but it's like, where'd that come from and why is that a big deal? For me, that's a pretty powerful testimony to, kind of go. But I think, when we see the beginning of birth pangs, whether we're here or not, I think, like James said, it's going to be something that we can't even imagine the breadth and the scope of. All right, and I know we had a couple of quick questions.
Well, I was just going to, in his question, we are in the end times. When Jesus died on the cross, that was the start of the end times.
The start of the end times, yeah. We just a whole lot closer, yeah.
It's not like that yet, but it's going to get.
Right. But in terms of, to answer your question, in terms of the phrase, the beginning of birth pangs, that's where you line up Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, and you see these kinds of signs. And he says, that's just the beginning. Kind of like what James says, like, yeah, this is just the beginning, but wait until you get toward the Great Tribulation, which is the last 3.5 years. And that's split by the abomination of desolation there in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. So I just want to say a couple quick things. If we look back through chapter 6 and talk about the horses for just a second, of course, everybody knows that's the four horsemen, right? 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you think about the white horse, and James sort of mentioned this, that this is sort of a mimicry, the false Christ. So he's going to appear like Christ. You notice that he has a bow but no arrows. Okay, because he's a conqueror, but he conquers peacefully. And what do we know about the Antichrist in terms of the way that he's going to come on the scene and function as a uniter? And if you know anything about Judaism and Islam, what are both Judaism and Islam looking for? A Messiah who will be a world ruler who will bring world peace. Okay? So that really lines up with the whole white horse thing. But also, general would be the victorious general would be the one to ride the white horse. So that lines up as well with the whole white horse is the first horse. How about the second horse? Second horse is the fiery horse, right? And sometimes it gets translated as red. I've seen it translated in other languages as orange, because they're trying to figure out what color to call fire. What do you call a fire colored? What color is that? Blue, orange, yellow. All fire is all those colors, right? So, and fiery is actually a good translation. But why a fiery horse? What's the significance? Remember what it's associated with? War and destruction. I mean, if you think about any war you've ever seen in terms of a war movie, you know, everything's blowing up and everything's on fire, right? So, I mean, that makes very good sense as far as the association of the color. So that's your second horse. Third horse is the black horse. And what do we know about black from Scripture in terms of what we would associate that with? Death, but I want to hear some word. Darkness, okay? But darkness is really, if you think about the universe, or if you think about, you know, hell, you know, one of the descriptions of hell is this place of emptiness. And so when you're talking about famine, you're talking about a lack. You're talking about a vacuum. You know, something where there's nothing there. You want something, but there's nothing there. And it's one of the associations that the Bible makes when it talks about hell, is that there's nothing there. You know, and it's like the blackness of hell is reserved for them forever. It's like, wow, in the absence of God, what is there? There's nothing. It's just emptiness. So that makes perfect sense in terms of, you know, when we talk about the concept of a famine, you know, that there's this worldwide lack of stuff. It's just emptiness. All right? So that's where it's good association with black. So that's the third one. How about the fourth one? What's the fourth one? Pale horse. Actually, the Greek word is chloros. Sound familiar? Clorox, chlorine. Okay? So, you know, the translation in most English translations is pale, but think with me for just a second about the color of chlorine. Okay? What color do you call that? It's kind of this pale green, right? Well, where else do you see that? Dead person. Dead person. Yeah. So perfect color choice for if you're talking about death and, you know, like massive, like James mentioned, just a worldwide dead people laying all over the place, and they're all chlorine colored. Yeah, wow, what an image. All right. So very, very interesting. Before we finish tonight, I want to do one last thing. And now that we've talked about the four horses, we've gone through the first 6 seals. I want to talk with you for just a second, because you read a lot of commentaries or hear a lot of preaching about this, and when people talk about Revelation sort of as a whole, one of the things that they will do is they'll say, well, there were seals, and then there's trumpets, and then there's bowls, and they all kind of overlap, and it's just kind of different pictures for the same kind of stuff. And the fact is, no, they're actually, each one is a different series of events involving different things. And if you follow it through consistently, what you find is that there really is a difference between those types of judgments. But what I want you to see, and you will hear me say this again, so don't worry if you don't catch it the first time, is let's go back to our movie and think through this for just a second. Because what we have is, we have the introduction of the king in chapter 1, right? And we have the letters from the king in chapters 2 and 3. And then we have the throne room where they're having the rally and they're getting ready. And then the movement from there to the scroll where you start the judgments with the scroll that has the seals, right? So if we think about it from a movie or kingdom perspective, think about, I'm in the kingdom, and I'm part of this kingdom with the king, and the war is against those people. In this case, Revelation refers to them as those who dwell upon the earth, or the earth dwellers. It's actually a technical term, okay? You'll hear me say that again too. But, okay, the war is against them, and the judgment is going to be against them. And the king and his kingdom are going to go to war against them. First thing that happens, king makes a pronouncement of war. It's a decree of war, okay? So you have the seals, and that we're starting the war. We're sending out our messengers, right? The messengers are preceding us, and you know, if you've seen the war movies where the messengers are coming, so okay, we're about to come beat you up, you know, right? And then the people go, uh-oh, you know, or not, you know, or like, yeah, bring it on, you know. Whatever their response is, you get the idea that there are those forerunners who are coming forward to get, so like, get ready. You know, get ready, here we come. So you have the 4 horsemen as part of the 4 seals that are part of that decree. So again, that's the first piece of that movement of the king and his kingdom in war against that enemy kingdom, okay, in order to bring about the eventual defeat of that kingdom. So you have that first is the seals, and then the seals lead to the trumpets. So I want you to see this progression, kind of like James was talking about, just within the seals. There's also progression there. Because if you think about the forerunners, the horsemen going out and making those pronouncements, and that's sort of the first step in the decree with the seals, and then you move to the trumpets. When do the trumpets happen? When do you blow trumpets? When you're at the enemy's doorstep, right? I mean, think about it when you've read about it in the Old Testament, where they come against the kingdom, they're at the enemy's walls. Here we are, okay? So, if you think about it from that perspective, in terms of our movie, we move from the decree and the forerunners with the horsemen to the announcement of our arrival at the enemy's gates with the trumpets, okay? So hopefully that'll help you in terms of visualizing the way it all fits together. And Revelation does a beautiful job of communicating it, at this another level. So then you think about your medieval war movies, and you're at the kingdom's gates, and you want to pour it out, okay? And what are your last judgments? The largest judgments? The bowls, okay? So the bowls of wrath. So if you think about it from that perspective, again, it's, we're starting the war, we're decreeing the seals, the forerunners, then we're at the gate, we're blowing the trumpets, we're, announcing a war, and then it's all full out.